What I didn't tell Maddie is that as we have successive reader rooms, the guest at the one comes and hosts the next one. So it was in the fine print in the contract. You might not have noticed it.
With pleasure.
We'll have you back. We'd love that. Madeleine Thien needs no introduction. I've been a fangirl, ever since forever. I'm older than you, so not quite forever, but ever since you sort of burst on the scene. She's written stories and novels, a libretto, as we now know, and has had her books published in Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, translated into 25 languages, which is, you get them, and I only know this because my mother was a writer. You sometimes get a book and you don't really know what language it's in. Do you have some of those? We think maybe Polish, maybe Hungarian.
When it arrives,
Yes.
when it arrives, and I'm like, oh, what? I feel like I know, but I'm making a guess.
Yeah. Then you show it to friends and say, does this look familiar to you? And she has won the 2016 Scotiabank Giller Prize for the book we all know and probably have on our bedside table bookshelf, and if you don't, they're for sale at the front. Do Not Say We Have Nothing. A fantastic title. I want to ask you about that title at some point. And an Edward Stanford Prize, shortlisted for the 2016 Man Booker Prize. That's one of the big ones. The 2017 Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction and the Folio Prize for 2017. And this is a big deal if you're in the book business. Named a New York Times critic's top book of 2016. And that's good in two ways. First of all, those critics are not easy. They're just, some of them are toughies. And secondly, Madeleine now lives in New York, so, it's a good thing. And the book was longlisted for a Carnegie Medal. But enough about Maddie. I'm going to talk about me. No. I am going to talk. When Maddie walked in, I said, "You're a librettist now." I mean, everybody, who doesn't want to have librettist in their CV?
I think you said on their grave.
I did say that. I'm thinking ahead for posterity. Novelist and librettist. I mean, really, that is more interesting than just novelist, don't you think?
Way more.
Yeah, and you can have a few notes. I'm thinking ahead.
Yes,
I'm thinking ahead. Anyway, can you tell us a little bit about Chinatown, the opera, and when I know I have tickets for a matinee. Saturday? Would that be Saturday? And how can people still get tickets? And tell us just a little bit about it.
Okay. First, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Howard, for the introductions. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm feeling a little emotional. There's something about coming home and this neighborhood where I grew up. Oh, I am going to get emotional.
Tissues.
And seeing the Storytelling Center for the first time, it's really a gift. So Chinatown, the opera, is, as far as we know, the first opera to be staged here in North America in Hoi San. It is a story about found family. It's set in Vancouver's Chinatown. You will hear the words Maine, Pender, Kiefer quite a lot. It's a story that starts in the 1890s and goes to 1961, following the life of one man named Shunpon. And it has music by the composer Alice Pigny-Ho. The Hoi San is I basically co-created it with Paul Yee, which was the honor of a lifetime to work with Paul. And I feel an incredible cast of singers, a chorus, and an incredible conductor, Mary Chun. But I feel I do need to let people know, and maybe people already know, that it was supposed to be the world premiere of the opera Chinatown. It is no longer the world premiere because we lost our production side of the opera, who resigned. But with full support of the story that we're telling, but they felt that under certain conditions that had occurred, they could not execute the plan that they had. Yeah. So it is in a concert staging. You will hear all the amazing music. You'll see all the story. There will not be any props or set or costumes. But I just wanted to say that that production side, also the director and the producer all resigned. They are an extraordinary group of people, and they did everything possible to make this production happen. And we are all united in believing we are going to make the production happen. It's just going to take a little longer than anticipated. But I hope you will come to support. We decided to go ahead out of respect for the musicians and the singers.
And you'll be putting the orchestra on stage?
Orchestra is on stage. You'll see Mary conducting. I must say, Alice's music is phenomenal.
You can see a little bit, hear a little bit on YouTube.
You can hear some on YouTube. It's about families, paper sons, work. Yeah, everything. I really hope you'll come. Tickets are still available. It is not the final thing, but it is something we're all very, very proud of. And I think a lot of production people will be attending out of support and all of that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a tough situation to be in, but something of beauty is still built and will be visible. And I always think of the image of, you know, those rugs that are beautiful at the top, and you flip them and you see all the knots and the mistakes on the bottom. And I always think that's kind of the interesting side, you know, where you see where the people stopped work for the day and they came back the next morning and the dialogue was a little bit different. Anyway, you're producing both sides of the rug. So the beautiful part, the top part, and the knots and the mistakes too.
Yes.
But ultimately, at some point, it will all come together. So thank you for making this for us. Thank you. I had a fun question for you, and it's going to, if you don't fall off your stool, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes.
Okay.
And I want you to imagine that a genie has picked you up and dropped you somewhere in Chinatown in Vancouver. How would you know where you are without opening your eyes? What would tell you where you are?
What would tell me I was in Chinatown?
Yeah, in Chinatown in Vancouver. Would it be smells, sounds? Would you feel bricks? Would you have a sense of space? Or would you have to peek?
I think I would know. It would be the voices, the Cantonese language, the Poisantu, and it would be, you know, when you grow up in a certain place, you know the way the wind moves through certain streets. You know that there's a particular sound to things moving along the sidewalk, and bells and doors and movement. I actually, when I was a university student, I was really interested in making radio documentaries. And I walked through Chinatown so many times with my recording mic just to capture the soundscape of Chinatown. I probably still have these recordings. I would go into shops and stand there with my microphone until they were fantastic. Like, go away. It was quite wonderful. I love it.
I can see Ramona's ears go, she wants these for her archives, I'm sure.
They're on like mini disc. They're quite good quality. Yes.
Follow up. Now, Chinatown, interestingly enough, is a construct, really. And I know you've written a bit about this, and there's a wonderful podcast called 99% Invisible. I don't know if any of you follow it, but it's about design. And I'd listened a few years ago to a podcast about sort of the invention of Chinatown and the architecture of Chinatown. And I know you've written about this, so can you talk a little bit about the beginnings of what we all think about as a recognizable Chinatown?
Yeah, I'm sure there will be lots of other knowledge base here, but from what I understood, there's both the creation of the construction of certain styles from back home. There's all of that, but there was also a desire to find an architecture that would be both, that would make Chinatown feel non-threatening to outsiders, something colorful and beautiful, a safe, exotic space, a facade behind which lives could be lived, and that kind of like unknown and more hidden spaces could evolve. But there was a kind of like, what faced out was meant to both be welcoming and also to keep safe what was inside. And I found that research I was doing into the architecture really interesting about how the Chinese community had to make people not afraid of it.
Because before that time, there was some fear and some rumor mongering and othering. And this was a way, I think it's, you know, we all live in constructed environments, let's face it. And this was in some ways it was a stroke of genius, don't you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because it also was like, you know, there's a kind of play to it too, and like, okay, you can come and be delighted. Yes. You know, you'll come and you'll see one surface of things, but there are so many layers to this place, and I think that that's a constant in all the Chinatowns. It's the layering, and when you grow up inside it, I mean, I remember as a child loving being in Chinatown. Like, it was magical. You could get all the things you wanted, and everything was like, it was both this protective space and a child's wonder. And you know, back then in the 80s, I remember it was just packed all the time. It was like a sea of people, and the triple parking, and my dad got so many tickets, and the lineup from the baklak, you know, you'd go for dim sum, and the lineup would be down the stairs and around the corner. I loved this place. Yeah.
I have a quote from you I'm just digging for. Here we go. And it really is a question of what we're talking about. You wrote in the Guardian and a few other places, in the 1980s, many Chinese immigrants to Vancouver hoped to prosper and leave behind the struggles of Chinatown, but I suspect they believed and hoped the enclave would persist. Its sometimes kitschy atmosphere allowed for memory without sentimentality, nostalgia freed from rigid tradition. Its alleyways and buildings are the physical evidence of a discriminatory history as well as a population that has always flourished in community form. I love that phrase. That's a wonderful phrase. So in a sense, the Chinatown protected it, but also created community.
Yes, I think, you know, one of the things in the opera that I really wanted to think about was how that bachelor community, you know, the early on, the ones that lived through the Exclusion Act and the war and who couldn't bring their families, how they created they survived through community. And then they probably experienced in some ways, when the children finally arrived, when they were like, that they could have fuller families, the departures. It was like you could make this incredible space in which we could flourish, but then it meant that they had the strength and the solidity to leave it. And I thought that complexity was something, I think that's kind of at the heart of the opera, the men who build it and then have to watch their children departing it.
Yeah, it was like a way station in some ways.
Yeah, but then there's also it was so interesting because there was also the ones who definitely were there to like, I'm gonna be the tent peg here, you know, I'm gonna stay in this space, I'm gonna keep building in this space, and you know, the 61, through the 60s when they were trying to demolish all of that history of like how the protest and the organization and the passion for respecting what those men had built, to me is sorry, I'm gonna get emotional again. It's the opera. It's all like been so intense that I'm feeling a lot of things about it, and out of respect for men, many of whom didn't have the chance to leave children behind.
Right, and some of them were very young, 14-year-old boys, young boys, and coming here and making their way. It's astonishing, a tale of true hardship. And overcoming.
Yes, and then in the 60s, along with the demolitions, there's also these, like the largest immigration crackdowns at that time were all in Chinatowns. I mean, they were targeted in so many legal ways that I kind of was astonished by them at every turn.
So you learned a lot in writing the opera as well.
So much. Yeah. You know, it's that weird thing of like you think you know the place because you grow up, you know the sidewalks, you know all the stories, you know everything, but then there's so much I didn't know. I knew in a factual way, but I didn't know.
When you are writing, you continue to teach and write. How much does sense of place play into where you start from? And I'm going to read you a quote. I pulled together a few years ago a collection of my mother's writing advice. My mother was a writer as well. And she grew up in Oak Park, Illinois. And she wrote, I need my different glasses. She didn't write that. She said, there was much that was narrow, smug, and hypocritical in the Oak Park in the 50s. But eccentricity flourished in these tree-lined streets. And she said that the setting provided what every writer requires, an image or a promise even that there is more possibilities, more ways of being, something beyond this cheerful parochial world, hers was. So my question is sort of a two-fold one. One is you get a lot in Chinatown, but there also is a border to Chinatown which you can see beyond, and you can see that there's more. It's not really a question, it's more of grounding yourself, but also being free to go outside of your where you're grounded in your writing.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Or impossible to answer.
Yeah, impossible to answer. I mean, I think I always felt very grounded here. I feel like for most of our childhood, we rarely went west of Maine. Rarely went to the beaches unless they were in Burnaby on a lake, like Burnaby Lake. But I felt like, you know, I think like the last story in Simple Recipes is called A Map of the City, and she's always continuously saying the names of the streets. That was definitely something I felt like I could, if you just told me where to start, I don't think I can do it anymore, but I could just list the streets off one by one by one by one, all the way across East Vancouver.
Yeah.
And I felt a real pride and ownership, because from the time we were young, we were always taking the bus, because my parents were working a lot. So the bus up Hastings, Commercial Drive, East 49th, East 41st, you know, and we lived in Burnaby for a while. So, and then by the drive, and went to school here, and yeah, I felt incredibly grounded, but I also desperately wanted to see the world. Yeah. Desperately.
I think that's part of it, yeah. There's the boundary, but boundary gives you something to push against. I guess that's what I'm getting at. It gives you a place to be interior, but it gives you a sense of exterior and what that means as well.
Yes, because I think I have friends who I grew up with that never felt at home in the city, but have never left it. And I think that's interesting, too. It's almost like they're still looking for that grounding here before they can leap, whereas I ended up being quite, I wanted to go everywhere. You know, I'd go spend 5 months in Southeast Asia or travel through China for months, and then I just wanted to soak up so much of, especially Asia. I really wanted to soak it up.
And when you're not in Asia, when you're in another city, do you look for their Chinatown? Does that
always?
Yes.
Always, and also like the satellite Chinatowns, you know, because they say in Manhattan, there's Manhattan Chinatown, but then there's Sunset Park, and then there's Flushing, and like I really like all the different little spaces, different, it's really interesting what is consistent and what is particular to where it sits in a particular borough. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about foreignness, because I was thinking about this, you know, I think you mentioned there's parts of the city where you felt more comfortable being and others maybe less. And we have this narrative that we know where we are, we know where we come from. And I was thinking about the fact that, you know, we've all read them, these cozy mysteries where they're set in an English village, and with, you know, people eat mutton at lunchtime and have tea at 4. And I've always thought, it's so strange that I feel like that's my home. But I've spent way more time in Chinatown than I've spent in a village in England. Why is that? Why it's a way of writing that assumes something about your background. Do you feel like you're at home in those cozy English mysteries, you know, where the vicar solves all the mysteries and they all have tea and, you know what we all read them, right? Does that feel home? Like, because of force of having read them, does that feel like home too, or is that always a different place?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I also feel at home in them.
Yeah. Isn't that weird?
Yeah. I was trying to think why that would be.
Yeah, why is it?
Yeah.
Have you ever had mutton at 4 o'clock?
Never had mutton at 4.
Yeah. I don't know when they eat mutton, but there must be a time.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? They created, and it's like when the first time you go to New York, you feel like you've been there before.
Yes.
Because you've seen all those places. It's a certain kind of storytelling that builds something inside you.
But do you think it's, like when you're a reader, like if you grow up reading a lot of books, your ability to enter a space
Yes.
and be happy at the side of the room,
Yes.
watching the goings on, I feel like that becomes a physical thing you're able to do. Because I loved reading as a kid, and it was my escape and my education. And I think it actually translates physically. I do feel like when I move through spaces, I am kind of always at the side. I love watching people going back and forth. I mean, I realized, it took me a long time to realize that my favorite place to write is at a cafe window, because I like to see, especially from like 7 in the morning or earlier if possible, I like to see the sidewalk wake up. I like to see people on their way to work, and I like to see the children then coming in the crocodile, with the preschool stuff, and I like to see like the unfolding of things. Mm-hmm. And I'm less happy when I'm sitting in a room facing a wall, or I like to see the routine of people. Yeah. I don't know how I got there from that question.
Well, my grandmother had a great saying, wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah. I decided I feel cozy in the tea room because other people are having tea and I get to watch them having...
But you said something, it's about the power of storytelling, really. You're conveyed, so I've never been to Tiananmen Square except in your novel. Took me to Tiananmen Square. And so I have this idea that I've been there. And I think it's what you touched on early in that response was the power of reading, or listening to narrative too.
Listening, yes.
To take you somewhere that becomes familiar to you because of the force of the telling.
The force of the telling and the openness of one's imagination. That thing, I know I've said it before, but it's just like, the thing when you read is you're lending all your senses and your body to the narrative. So you lend, it's, when someone walks across the room, you kind of feel your feet walking across the room, and something gets lifted or put down, and you kind of feel it with your hand, like you're lending all your physical self to this thing that exists on the page. And I think that, for me as the writer, I know that I rely very much on the willingness of the reader to imagine beside me. I think I don't write the kind of work where I can really take in an unwilling reader. I really need someone who's going to be like, okay, I'll go with you. I'll help you create this as we go, because I think I veer more sometimes towards the poetic or the atmospheric, and they need to kind of create that with me.
And I think you do it beyond compare. I mean, you create your willing reader because you lead them. You have a confidence of voice that tells the reader, I'm going somewhere and it's going to be great. So that's sort of something that you want to convey. I mean, not that the story is going to be great, not necessarily the place you're taking them. But I have another question, which is, as a writer, how do you know when you've put in enough details about what the room looks like? You can describe every inch, or you can sketch. How do you know when you put enough description to place someone firmly in a particular spot?
Good question. It's just a feel, it's because I think in a way a narrative is never at rest. So it's about the modulation of emotion.
Yes.
It's the pace at which we move through the room. It's not necessarily the number of details, it's the pace at which we move through it and the details come to us. But the eye is not necessarily darting around, but things come into our sight.
So if you write a street scene or an interior scene in an apartment, like you've described in Chinatown, can you, as a writer, sort of look around the room and see a desk and a chair? Do you have an interior vision that's visual, that you can see?
after years, sometimes I've been writing about that room for a long time, and
Yeah.
it's like
Oh,
5
that
years,
room,
I'm like,
yeah.
oh my goodness, there was a chair there. Yeah. You know, my partner Rawi is a writer and a
writer as well,
photographer.
yeah.
And that's something he always says, that he enters the room like a photographer. Like he knows where he's positioned spatially in relation to everything else. I actually don't experience that. I have a feeling for where I am. And I have to admit, I feel like my eyes are closed and I mostly am hearing and feeling. It's hard to describe.
So it's more other senses.
Yeah, I'm a touch. I like to touch.
Smell, scent?
Smell, yep.
Yeah. They're very powerful. We know they're among the most evocative of our senses. You've written just a bit about the development in Vancouver of other Chinatown spaces, for example, Burnaby, and I can add Richmond. But and you've mentioned about other cities that have different Chinese new spaces. And so talk a little bit about how you experienced that, because that's quite a change from your childhood.
Oh, well, you know, because my dad used to live by Joyce Station, so at the Boundary and Kingsway, that area. And when we were kids, for a year or two, we moved a lot. So I feel like every neighborhood, I can say, oh yeah, I lived there. But we lived by Willingdon, Kingsway, where Metrotown starts. But when we lived there, it was before SkyTrain was built. And the road that leads to Metrotown was a dirt road. And I used to, I had this game I played. My dad was like, there's something wrong with you. But when the SkyTrain was built, so I could see it from my bedroom window. And then I would go to school and come back, get off at Metrotown and walk along this dirt road home. And it was so empty that I would walk it with my eyes closed.
Wow.
And my dad could see me from the window walking like this, and he was like, what is wrong? You should not do that. But it was such a different landscape. Why I was going to get to other Chinatowns elsewhere. Oh yeah, so we saw that whole Crystal Mall. So that was later, we moved away. Then my dad moved back to that neighborhood, and then Crystal Mall was there, and Metrotown was expanding, and then to see that's a more mainland Chinese, I think more mainland, there's more, you hear more Mandarin.
Right.
In that space, and that was really interesting for me. Actually, hearing the change, like from the Cantonese that I remember hearing to more and more Mandarin, that's something the ear has tracked over the years. And also because my Cantonese is not very good, I have a little bit as my mom would say, my tones are crooked.
Is that endearingly, I hope she says that lovingly.
That used to be that people would switch to English when they heard my so-so Cantonese, and now they often switch to Mandarin.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is kind of interesting. They're thinking that I'm speaking like this because I'm not a natural Cantonese speaker. Well, anyway, either way I'm doing so, they know it doesn't come so easy for me.
Yeah. Have you written in Mandarin or Cantonese? No, you could.
I can.
Yeah.
No. I have like this story I sometimes tell, that my mom had almost no books on her shelves, and when she passed away, there was one book I remember seeing, and it was in Chinese. I didn't know what it was, and I only found out after she passed away that it was Dream of the Red Chamber, the classic novel.
Yeah.
I had never known that the one book on my mom's shelf was a novel.
Right.
And I was sort of shocked to realize that after the fact. That she had carried it from Hong Kong. It was her favorite novel. I never knew.
Yeah.
I never knew.
Even mothers have secrets. You think they don't, but they do.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is kind of wonderful, really. We should allow them their secrets.
Yeah. I treasure that book. Yeah.
You would.
And her dictionary. Yeah.
You know, there's writers like Jamaica Kincaid is a good example that go back to the same territory and the same stories over and over again and rewrite them to get to the heart of them and get to understand them. Is Chinatown like for you at all, in terms of, it's a concept, it's robust, it will continue to give you stories, you'll come back to it, you've come back to it obviously with this opera.
The opera is the most directly I've written about it. And I kind of purposely chose to set it in years that I didn't experience.
Yes.
Because I was really interested in the place it was before I arrived in that wave of immigration. I think when you arrive in a wave, you don't necessarily understand what was there before sometimes, and that's what I wanted to focus on. I rarely write about Chinatown. I find it very hard. It's like that, I don't know, maybe for a weird way, it was like a secret place for me.
There's a great quote about writing, I don't remember who said it, that when we write about a place, it's both to understand it, but also to protect it.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the interesting idea, that you, in a way, you write about a place because you have a certain proprietorial or protective sense to it.
You know the things that are closest to you sometimes are the hardest to write about.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, because you know how complex it is, and every time you try to put it to paper, you realize you've only put this surface on or this facet of it, and it's like it's not good enough. Like you can't. That's, I think, part of the problem for me writing about some of my very particular memories of this space. I don't know how to describe it. And yeah, my parents are both passed away. I think that.
So there's some pain associated with it, as a loss, and and I think that's all part of it, of a profound place. I mean, I'm confident the Indigenous stories are the same. There's this sense of what was, a sense of marvelousness, and a sense of loss, and that's important too.
It is the kind of thing that it's what kind of survives in us is what's unresolved, and maybe there's something about that. Like if I wrote about it, it would feel like a resolution, and I kind of don't want it.
Yes, I get that. Yes,
Yeah.
There, I've done that. I've mastered it. Yes, yeah. And it never. But the great reality is, it never will be mastered. No matter what you write, it will still be. There will still be rough edges or things you would do differently. It's sort of it's because it's such a vigorous place. So tell me, when you choose places to write about now, what places call to you? Is it, you're in Brooklyn? Does Brooklyn call to you? Places you've been on visits?
It takes me a long time. Right now, I'm writing for the first time about in a more speculative thing. Well, I don't know what to call it, but I'm writing about a future time. And I'm writing about 3 centuries in the past, and they're all kind of intertwining in a building that's made of time.
Oh,
and
goodness.
Yes, it's like kind of amazing, but totally impossible. So I've really been struggling with it. It's just, it's a place that in my head is called the sea, and I think of it like a complex knot, like a panchang knot or a constellation knot, where time is like folding under other times, and they meet in like hallways and passageways, but it feels quite normal to the people who live inside it. In a way, it's either the place where there's all times or where time has stopped. It's sort of both at the same.
This is fascinating.
Yes, but I've been working on it for 7 years, and it's been I mean, I'm kind of happy to be living in it, but I don't know how much longer I can bear it. I think I'm almost there.
Yeah, but it's such a tricky concept. I mean, a building made of time. We don't know yet. Well, I think I'm thinking about light, whether light is a particle or a wave.
Yes, it's like that.
Yes.
It's also like Einstein's, time is space, and
Yeah.
space is time. So
Yeah.
I'm basically making a spatial.
Did you ever see that wonderful 24-hour movie, The Clock? That's all about time.
The Clock,
Yeah.
Yeah. It made me feel claustrophobic.
Yeah.
I was like,
I don't think you watched the whole thing right
Yeah.
through. Yeah. I think that sounds fascinating. Do you have a deadline? Because deadlines are very useful for finishing books. Thinking about time.
No. Someone asked me to put a timeline on it, and I was like, just thinking about a timeline kind of makes my heart pound. I can't.
Yeah.
It'll be ready when it's ready.
Yeah, the great line, it's not finished.
Yeah, it's still taking its time.
Yeah. Did you ever read A Short History of Time? Did you make your way through?
No.
The famous.
Stephen Hawking, yes. No,
Most of us got to page 15 or so. Yeah. Has anyone actually finished the whole book, A Short History of Time? Well, you might. Don't go try and read it. So, well, I'm looking forward to that book. Does it tentative title?
I can't say.
Yeah. I think Iceland had. Has anyone been to it? There was a museum of time for a while in Iceland. Has anyone been to that? It was temporary. funnily enough. It was on the West Coast.
I went once, I forget where, I feel like it was Croatia, the Museum of Broken Relationships. And it was like people sent things from their breakups, and they were in glass cases.
Yeah.
It was so amazing. It was really, it was sad, but it was also like some people were definitely liberated from, you know, and it was like, I think the fact that you had this thing that was precious to you and it could just go in a place where things that were precious to other people, but they marked something that was no longer, it was kind of amazing. Yeah, it's kind of a museum of time. Yeah,
a bad time that's ended. The museum of bad times, bad things that ended, I was going to ask as well, style, you're going to be in, this is more of a speculative fiction, so that's, but in some ways, I mean, you've mentioned a couple times that you've written about times when you haven't been there. And is that because, I mean, fiction gives you the ability to invent. But you also draw factually. And how much do you have to adhere to what actually happened in fiction, and how much can you take one foot off the ground and go in your own direction?
For me, I feel like I have to have a very, very, very solid grasp of the history. I think it's what it takes me so long, because I do a lot of research, I do a lot of reading. I think it's also because I've been writing about histories that are contested or erased.
Yes, yeah.
So it's really important for me not to invent in a way that adds to the problem of the erasure.
Right. So you feel a sense of responsibility to history, even as a novelist.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then from there, because that's the groundwork and the atmosphere and the world in which they're living, and then the characters come from that.
Yeah. They present themselves as you research.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I have them in my mind, and then I research, and I start to understand them better. I sort of always feel like they already existed.
Yeah.
It just takes me a really long time to see them clearly, and it takes me a long time to learn the world that they come from so that I can see them, but I don't feel like I invented them. I feel like I'm just the slowest one to perceive them.
They're surfacing somehow.
They're already there.
Yeah.
It's just that I can't see very well.
It's interesting. You feel a sense of responsibility toward them, toward history.
I love them.
Ah.
Yeah, I love them.
There's a great saying, I don't know who said it at the end. There's two kinds of writers, those that hate their characters and those that love their characters. We have people who hate like Stephen King. You know, they harm them. I mean, they harm them in all sorts of ways. Can you harm one of your characters?
I try to save them sometimes, but sometimes I know that
they can't happen.
This is the trajectory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even then, I know I saw Romeo and Juliet a couple of weeks ago here at Barton Beach, and I said to Christopher Case, can't they live just once in a while? Like every 100th time? He said, no, and they can't. But yes, I understand the wish to save your characters. Yeah. But it makes them more complex if the bad guys have good stuff and the good people have, that's how people are.
Yes, I love them. They're very imperfect characters, but I...
But you love them anyway.
They show me a lot about the complexity of living.
Yeah. And us, the reader, as well, which is good. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you as well, when you were talking about hearing, and in your novel, Do Not Say We Have Nothing, you use music quite a bit. And is music do you listen to music while you're working? Is music a common source of inspiration for you?
It is now. And it only started with Do Not Say We Have Nothing. And I feel like the whole tempo of my writing was totally changed with that novel.
I talked to someone today who listened to the Goldberg Variations as they were reading your book, just as the background.
Yes, because the Goldberg Variations are so integral to this novel. The structure, the feel, the possibility of how you can take a small motif of notes, 5 or 6 notes, and then Bach does these incredible variations that take you through this whole spectrum of human emotion out of just this seed of like 5 or 6 notes. And I kept thinking, can a novel do that? Could it start with this simple motif that keeps getting altered and transformed, but it's always from the same root. But it takes us through this panorama. And then, you know, the Goldberg variations end with the aria that were at the beginning. So it's like, it is like this accordion. It opens, and then it folds back into its little self again. I feel like I learn a lot about structure from music.
Well, that's
I find it more
interesting.
inspiring than like a craft book about narrative or about 3-act structure. I really love thinking about structure in music.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
I know Vikram's done a couple of books that are orchestral based and structural based, the same thing. Now I think we have time for questions. If anyone has questions for Maddie, I've got pages and pages, so I could go on for hours talking to you. But I also feel, I wanted to say one thing before we open this up. I ask heavy questions. I don't know why. Does writing bring you joy? Do you?
So
Yeah,
much.
Let's talk about joy just a little
Yes.
bit. Yeah.
Actually, I think that's what I've been working on for the last 5 or 6 years, is a novel that is really a study. I want it to be an experience of joy.
Yeah.
It also has difficult things, but a recurring motif in it is what it means to experience happiness. Mm-hmm. What is the it's a novel that's really about friendship, devotion, joy. But it's also, you know, challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not unadulterated. But like, I want to be sure we mention the joy of the joy of writers often say of having written rather than the joy of writing.
I find joy in the writing.
Yeah.
I mean,
good for you.
You know, it's so hard sometimes, especially when you're like I feel at this point I've written like 900,000 words, and I'm not getting it right, and I keep going back to it, and I cried a lot over this book, so much.
Does Rory read it as you go along, or do you?
I would not be able to do it without Rowie.
Right.
I mean, I depend on him.
Living with a writer in the house is kind of useful, I think.
Yeah, he's such a good reader, and he knows me really well, so
Yeah.
he often can put his finger on that thing that I'm wrestling with.
I wonder if anyone's ever published a book where they're still wrestling with it. Like it would come out, like 9,000 pages of it, and then a few weeks later, you get the next. Maybe you should think about that. Because I can't wait. I want to read it.
I finished a draft that I threw away, but I put it in
Yes.
a spiral binding because I was like, well, this is one iteration of it.
Yeah, one iteration.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I like the spiral bounding, given that it's about time and time. A metaphor. A free metaphor. Maddie is here. Does anyone have a question for her, or a comment, or anything? So I can carry on. We have, I think, 5 more minutes. Is that what we have, more or less? 5 more minutes. Is there anything you want to share with us about?
It's so amazing, this place, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, this space. Wow, wow. You know, one thing I will say with, you know, the Yuko Chao studio is if anyone goes to the opera, there actually was supposed to be a photograph taken in the Yuko Chao studio in the opera itself, but you won't see it because there's no production or props. But all these, I'm just seeing things that we wanted that are and will eventually be visible in this opera because we so wanted to pay tribute.
Well, people can come here, get an idea of what they're seeing, because this is a phenomenal space, and you won't have time tonight to see and do and touch and interact with everything, but it really is a remarkable place, a real gift to this city.
Oh, wow.
And a real destination. Then go listen to the opera, and you'll have the images already.
These are, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly like this.
I know Howard has a few things to say, I don't know where he went, about what's upcoming at the...
Are there any more questions?
Yes, go right ahead.
Actually, Grandma, I've loved your work for such a long time, like since the beginning, and I remember your radio work. And I'm wondering if you're ever going to do radio again, or now because podcasts are so popular, that you would be interested in delving into that area.
So the question, just for the recording, is about radio work, whether Maddie will go back to radio work and has still got an interest in that area. I think that's what I heard.
I would love to. I don't think I'm I'm not a talker, but I really like the soundscapes and the narratives and I really like the documentary form. I would love to make documentaries. I think it's it's almost my natural state. I feel like if I wasn't a novelist, I would probably have been a journalist or a documentary maker. That's kind of where I really like listening to people. I really like the way you ask one question and the person takes you somewhere else, and it's like you're making something together in the moment. I like that. So I think yes. I actually just the other day found my mini disc player in storage in a box, and I couldn't give it away with the microphone. The microphone. I mean, I've been in the box so long that what's that thing that goes on top of the microphone? The soft bit, the sock. It had disintegrated. But I kept it, and I kept all the mini discs. I had a whole box of mini discs, which I guess you don't see much anymore.
Well, you should get them transcribed probably before they fall to pieces, right? Or I don't know how stable they are.
I mean, I interviewed my dad. I mean, I have things
fantastic.
that are, and it must be with sound, because I also have the last voicemail message my mom left me on one of those little tapes, the answering machine tape. Yes, sound is really important to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a question here, a comment or a question.
Since you're working with a number of different genres, would you be interested in having that, for example, your 2016 book in a movie, as a movie? Is that at all of it?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yes, the question was whether I would be interested in having the 2016 book, Do Not Say We Have Nothing, adapted for film. I would love to. I think it's impossible. I just think the subject matter, the Tiananmen, the protests, the Cultural Revolution is also sensitive, but it's just the filming of Tiananmen, I just don't see that happening because it would get such a pushback.
You can make the set.
You can make the set, yes. You know, nothing of mine has ever been adapted for film, or even nobody's really shown interest in it either. I think it's something about the way I write. I think that, and I also think they're not always filmable. I don't think Dogs at the Perimeter, for instance, is filmable.
But there may come a time, you're still a young woman, when it will be possible to film that book. You know, that could occur. It might take a bit of time, but that's a possibility that there would be, timing, as they say, is everything. And there may come a time when its moment is arrives, because it is beautifully visual.
Yeah.
And sweeping.
It's visual.
Yeah.
And the music. I mean, I would just love to see those three in the music room, and I would love to hear, you know, they would have to make Sparrow's compositions, and I would love to see it, but to be honest, I kind of already see it. So maybe that's why the drive hasn't been so strong, because it's funny for me, like I still see those characters all the time. Like I feel like they follow me into rooms and they hang around. And when I'm daydreaming, they're just like hanging out on chairs, talking, doing their thing. So maybe that's why I haven't also had the drive. Like visually, they're kind of present with me all the time.
You know, there's an amazing director called Johnny Marr. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He has a base in Vancouver, but I'm just thinking he would do amazing things with that book.
Yeah.
Someone is trying to adapt it for opera. Do Not Say We Have Nothing. And I'm not doing that libretto, but the librettist is amazing, and who knows?
That would be
an amazing opera.
Yeah, it's sweeping. It's got that all the emotions. It's got all the emotions that you need in a good opera. Anyone else before we get Howard? Yes, back there. Yes.
Yeah, so you talked earlier about kind of Vancouver's Chinatown, and it's changed so much since you lived here, and you know a lot of the community is linked to other Chinatowns in the city and the neighborhood. What are your hopes or thoughts of what Vancouver Chinatown that we're in now kind of turns into in the future?
That's such a good question.
Do you want to repeat it just for the?
Oh yes. What my hopes are for this Chinatown in the future. Oh, it's such a hard question. I want to move back. That's what I would say. I wish people, the generation of mine, could come back here and live here and make art here and support the businesses here. And I wish that we all who had a connection to it could still call this place home. You know, I've not lived in Vancouver now since 2004, 2002. So it's been a long time. So I'm hesitant to comment on the city, which has changed so much since I've left. But it does feel like, as I walk around, I mean, I know this neighborhood very well, that I am quite shocked by what I see. And I feel like the pressures on these streets are, first, it's very hard to see. And the distress of people in the neighborhood. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think a place like this is the start of a really powerful answer, because it's one of those places it can't be fixed. It's not going to stay fixed. It's going to always be changing into something else. So that kind of ingenuity to reinvent itself while always sort of with this deep awareness of what it has been for so many people. I think that's the space we're trying to make. I wish I had a better answer.
I think that was a great answer. It was almost a manifesto for this space. It's a great question too. It's an excellent question. I'm glad that's recorded because I want to listen to it again. I think, do we have time for one more question? One more question? All right. We're going to call up Howard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Just so beautiful, Maddie. First off, thank you, Anne, we'll do it again. Yeah, you okay? Thank you.
If everybody will come again.
Yeah, we're coming in. Thank you for hosting such and carrying the conversation with us and taking us on a journey for yourself as well. And thank you so much, Maddie, for your generosity and openness and willingness to share. It's just so beautiful. Thank you for doing this. I want to do a big thank you to Charles Barber at City Opera, who is an extraordinary man in terms of his vision, in terms of really committing to telling stories through opera. And it's beautiful. Of course, his commitment to writers is extraordinary. Those of you who may know, he commissioned Margaret Atwood with this opera, Pauline. And so he's got this real love of authors and real love of that. So we wish you Maird and break a leg tomorrow. Thank you so much for being with us.